So with that, let me introduce the panelists. So we have Dr. Anant Nyshadham, who is Assistant Professor at University of Michigan and co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Good Business Lab. Good Business Lab is a nonprofit research and labor innovation firm with operations in India, the US, and Latin America. They primarily evaluate worker well-being programs and how they benefit not just workers, but bring in returns for employers. Next, we have Chitra Prasad, General Manager and Organizational Development at Shahi Exports. Shahi is India's largest garment exporter and is a supplier to many global apparel brands. They're well known for their initiatives towards sustainability and worker empowerment. And finally, we have Sarah Otto, Senior Director of Compliance at NEST. NEST is a nonprofit 501c3 supporting the responsible growth and creative engagement of the artisan and maker economy to build a world of greater gender equity and economic inclusion. So, and thank you to all of you for being here today to share your insights with us. We appreciate it. So now I'd like to open up the discussion. So let's start with why worker well-being is important, how it ties into transparency. And Anant from Good Business Lab, let's start with you. At Good Business Lab, you focus on conducting rigorous research trials to evaluate the impact of worker interventions that labor-intensive businesses take to improve well-being for their workforces. Can you tell us why it's important for supplier firms to care about worker well-being and why it should matter to the businesses involved? So how does it tie into transparency, which is our topic of the discussion today?
Yeah, thanks. I think that there's kind of two parts of this. So I think there's the, hey, worker well-being matters, investing in it is valuable. And then there's the transparency bit. So on the first bit about, how valuable is worker well-being itself and how much should firms care? Why is it good for business? I actually think in the kind of now over a decade and a half that I've been doing this, I would argue that the majority of stakeholders involved are kind of convinced of that core idea that GBL kind of espouses, that worker well-being is good business. Not only is it kind of an ethical thing to do to care about everyone involved, including the workers, but it's actually just like an efficient, performance-minded thing to do. That this kind of relationship between the employer and the employee, or for that matter, between brands and suppliers in the supply chain, is not zero sum. That actually we're all collaborating together, and so we don't have to worry about, for a fixed set of the pie, how much you get and how much I get. Let's enable each other, let's empower each other, and then the size of the pie itself will grow. Everyone wins, and there's more to go around, kind of thing. So I think that actually is relatively common, a common perspective. I don't think then that the issue is like the want to in terms of taking care of workers. It's more the know-how. That's to say, what are the specific root causes of these persistent problems we see? Let's define them really well. Let's be precise. After that, then, okay, what's the most impactful solution we can try, And can we get good evidence that this particular solution moves the needle on that particular problem and in fact does make good sense for business, does have a return for everyone involved? If so, how much? How much can we invest? So those are the types of questions that I think GBL's work really focuses on a lot, is the kind of the information bits about, okay, we're all agreed that we want to do this work. Let's find out what the problems are. Let's figure out solutions. Let's test them. Let's figure out how much we can do of each. That having been said, history has told us that there's oftentimes a different set of voices that are less convinced, maybe less forward-looking, less convinced that these problems are either solvable now or that the firm has a role in solving that problem, or that they're going to be cost-effective to worry about now. And we've seen time and time again that not always with workers, sometimes with consumers or product safety, but in general that you see, for decades that industries will try to sweep some of these problems under the rug or wait to solve them and say, look, now's not the time. It's going to cost too much. I think if anything from big tobacco or, big plastic to, of course, recent stuff around Me Too movement, gender issues and harassment in the workplace and so on. These are issues that we know executives have come across, know that they're happening, and then you have a few bad eggs or less progressively minded folks thinking that, hey, let's not worry about them right now. Let's sit on this and let somebody else deal with it later. It's not going to be worth doing. The era we're in now, social media, I think has really sped up the news cycle. It's allowed these issues to come to light faster. It's allowed people to speak up and then even coordinate, and support each other and corroborate each other's stories. And so that time that an industry or a firm or an executive can get away with pretending a problem isn't there or delaying a solution to it has become dramatically shorter. And that's a really exciting thing for organizations like GBL and for the work we're doing, because now we've got everyone, whether you like it or not, I think is more convinced that we need to deal with these types of issues. If there's an issue going on with workers, if there's a persistent and common problem, let's all get together and solve it now before it becomes a scandal. Even if you aren't one of the more progressively minded and you aren't convinced, you better get convinced in some sense now. And so I think that's really exciting. Oh, Adrian, I think you're on mute.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I was moving on to Chitra at Shahi. Chitra, a lot of the projects that Good Business Lab evaluates are implemented at the factories of Shahi Exports in India. At Shahi, you've implemented several worker well-being initiatives, including worker voice initiatives that Anant just mentioned. How did you decide to invest the time and the resources in these programs?
Thank you so much for this question. And Shahi has been implementing various worker well-being initiatives, whether it is soft skill training, capacity building initiatives, or women advancement, gender equity or gender parity, what we have been talking, skill development initiatives, in partnership with brands, government organization, research organization, NGOs, as well as we have our Shahi's homegrown program. And Shahi is almost 40 plus years old organization, and I've been part of Shahi for more than 11 years and leading most of the initiatives at Shahi. Being the oldest master trainer for gapping pace implementation to recent program implementation where we're talking about digital worker voice tool, Shahi has always kept workers as a permanent stakeholder. We term worker well-being as glorified term for social compliance. So, by doing all these initiatives for so many years, we have empowered, motivated workforce, and especially, we have a larger percentage of women workforce. So we are moving toward this helps us to move towards the part of gender parity. And also, all these initiatives or what we're doing is beyond compliance helps us to reach most of the compliance, issues which we are talking in most of the discussions. And in specific, talking about worker voice. Worker voice has always been issues since inception of garment industry. And if you Google about garment industry, we know there is a stigma attached about various issues, particularly on not being able to voice, workers are not able to voice out the issues due to non-availability of right grievance redressal mechanisms. Or, also they are scared about, there are a lot of issues on, getting themselves exposed. A lot of issues are there. And whether in specific, we talk about the issues, related to the collapse of the building at Bangladesh, or issues of abuse, harassment, or also even the simple case of where workers talk in the canteen committee, not having mugs, that's not enough in workplace. All these are the issues. What we talk about is about worker voice, which needs immediate attention. And Shahi has well established functional grievance redressal mechanisms such as suggestion box. We have 5 committees, we have welfare officers, we have OD, we have a lot of people working on this. However, time, transparency, confidentiality is a very focused thing when it comes to grievance. So with this, we are moving on to the digital tool, also called as a worker voice. Having that in place, we think it's a win-win situation for workers, for customers, and also as organizations themselves. So we have seen evidence through GBL being part of most of our worker well-being initiatives. We have seen both business impact and majorly social impact. And that has motivated Shahi to invest a lot on time and resources on worker well-being initiatives. Thank you.
Good. And you mentioned, digital systems. So I think we're going to touch upon that here in the next section. But before we do, moving on to Sarah at NEST. Sarah, NEST's work is unique in that it focuses on worker well-being for those workers who are not located in traditional factories. So we're talking about, moving from formal production facilities to workers that are working in their homes or informal small workshops. Can you tell us a little more about why these parts of the supply chain, what they look like, and why due diligence and worker well-being initiatives are important for these workers?
Thanks, Adrian. And Anant and Chitra, nice to be speaking with you today as well. So right now, the UN Foundation actually estimates that women make up 75% of the global garment and footwear production supply chains. And as we know, these workers are largely from the developing world and communities of color. And even beyond that, we think it's really important that the ILO estimates that more than 300 million people are working from home and engaged primarily in handwork. The majority of these home workers are also women. So we think that's a really important reason why these workers, even though they're not in structures like factories or four-walled facilities, are really important for inclusivity within the supply chain. So the structure of these informal and homework supply chains are really quite different than those in the factory. And though we as NEST see them as being equally as important, they do require a different approach when we talk about the success of reaching them effectively and creating worker voice and well-being initiatives. So one of the key differences immediately is that home workers are largely managed by some form of subcontractor. So right there and then you have less visibility into the worker level. As well, they're very rurally based and dispersed. So even if it's just being dispersed because they're outside of a central facility like a factory, they may also be spread out across a certain town or region, or even in some cases in different clusters around an entire country. These workers, are sometimes, part of a product being made from start to finish. In other cases, they're just adding embellishments to a portion of the final product that may go back to the factory. So the nature of their work tends to change. And also when we talk about fashion related trends, these workers are not always necessarily consistently working throughout the year, but they may have seasonal production during certain parts of the year and have other jobs such as farming during off seasons. So when we talk about visibility, we often find that there's hidden workers who are either assisting families or even are participating in the production, but they're not at all documented, they're not represented in the supply chain, and then because of that, they're not protected. So when we get down to the worker level, literacy and formal education levels are often low. And so they might also have limited access to or familiarity with technology that could be used more successfully in a place like an urban-based factory. So overall, we see that informal supply chains are, often unrecognized, and the workers within them, aren't necessarily protected. And so due diligence, just basic compliance is usually the exception rather than the norm. So we think that, it's really critical that these workers are part of the supply chain. And in some cases, they're seen as just kind of, supplemental workers, or that this is a hobby for them rather than their source of work and employment, even if it's part-time. So right now, we're just looking to see that suppliers and brands together can navigate due diligence and then promote homeworking as a way that it helps promote workers' well-being. And so we see homeworking as a really positive thing. And so for many female workers, this is sometimes critical for their ability to earn income for their families by also taking care of their children or tending to household duties. In some places, workers are also unable to leave the home due to cultural, religious, or even personal safety reasons. So working from home might even just be a necessity for them to have work at all. And then we see for all workers that are working from home, this actually allows them to provide more local employment opportunities that strengthen and build the communities that they live in, while also reducing urban migration to bigger cities. So we have seen that until quite recently, most of the worker well-being and worker voice initiatives have focused more primarily on tier 1 and the factory level. And obviously great strides have been made there, as you've heard today. But now we're really excited to see that that's growing a bigger focus towards the end workers and beyond the factory level. So for NEST, when we see that the same protections and systems for worker voice and improvements for well-being can be applied the same way that they are in a factory, although taking into consideration the differences in those supply chains, we see that this significantly increases inclusion, equity, and representation for these workers.
Thank you. And I think it's such an important topic to focus on this part of the supply chain. And I know NEST's work has been fantastic over the last decade. Just curious, what have you learned that was unexpected through your focus on this part of the supply chain, Sarah, and your work at NEST?
I think just taking into account how many workers are really represented there or should be represented once you gain transparency. We've had a lot of cases where a supplier may know a little bit about the supply chain, but once they get down to actually mapping it out, there's sometimes double the number of workers that they even thought they had in that supply chain. So I think more just understanding how big and how important those suppliers are to factories as well.
Great. So let's move on to talking about mechanisms that capture worker voice. And Chitra, I want to start with you. I'd like to take a step back and understand what kind of compliance and audit requirements are in place today to ensure good working conditions and well-being of factory workers. Are these requirements from brands? Are they part of government policy? Why are they being done today?
Yeah. So Shahi has the independent compliance team, like at the centralized or at the corporate level. Their work is majorly to monitor, guide, and also ensure that organization brands, local, like the COC or the local laws are met. And this team is headed by a chief compliance officer, who is directly reporting to board. So which means the heart of a business is also compliance, which because of the title and the power the person holds. Second is at the factory level, we have independent HR department whose major work is to ensure that the compliance are in place in the factory. And apart from this, we also have brands. Each local brand, they have the code of conduct and sometimes going beyond. They also come to factory, audit the factories, and also work closely with the supplier to work on the improvements on some of the on the compliance issues what is there in the factory. And recently, everybody talks about social, SLCP or social and labor convergence projects, and Shahi also is part of. Shahi also has it, and around 76% of our factories are upgraded to SLCP, and 35% of our customers have replaced their traditional audits with SLCP. So SLCP is basically it is a single assessment accepted with many of the brands. And it's not only this. From many years, brands also are not just focused only on audits. They also do beyond audits. Brands they have their own worker well-being programs through which is part of their CSR, and they collaborate with suppliers and they also implement a lot of worker well-being initiatives in the factories, the setup. Apart from that, like Shahi, we also have a dedicated organization development department where we independently, report to board or key persons of the organization, and majorly we focus on compliance and worker well-being initiatives. And this department takes a proactive approach in creating our own programs in partnership with various brands, research organizations, non-profits, and also like Good Business Lab. We have been partnering for more than 5 to 6 years now. And this is what we say, like beyond compliance. When we say we have recently launched one of the programs that's called as Migration Support Center, and partnering with Good Business Lab. We have ORMAS, that is with government as a partner of this project. That's Odisha Rural Development and Marketing Society. And we also have Shahi and H&M part of this project. So this project majorly focuses on and supports migrant community in Bengaluru, India, with access to services required to support their lives in an urban environment. Apart from this, we have the recent thought process, and we are working on developing workers at shop floor as compliance auditors. So, we have been talking to workers. We are also coming up with programs, where we'll give them soft skill training, and also we will also give them rights and responsibility and compliance training, and also for to support that some policies we're working, where we'll maybe like some incentives for them to do this work. But we majorly see it's not just the audits, which has to come from outside, but audit is a responsibility of everyone, including workers. And when workers voice their issues, when they're part of the compliance system, we believe that the bigger circle which was missing, the missing pieces, we're adding it. So that's where we have reached, when it what we're doing and what we're planning, when it comes to compliance for Shahi.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a really important point about the worker-centered approach, and I think looking at workers' voice as we're going through audits. You mentioned SLCP, and for those on the call, SLCP is an initiative where brands can use joint audits or one audit for a vendor or a supplier, which hopefully reduces the amount of audit fatigue for a supplier. And so, I think, Chitra, when I hear you talk about that, the hope I think from brands from a brand perspective is less audits allow, vendors and suppliers like Shahi to focus more on these initiatives around worker well-being and worker voice when you're not so busy worrying about, 20 different audits from suppliers. So, and I just think from a brand perspective as well, I think more and more brands are looking for suppliers to enact these types of worker well-being programs. From a brand perspective, it really demonstrates that a supplier's view on workers is that a worker is an asset and one that is important to invest in. So congratulations on some of your work. Sarah, moving to you. Good Business Lab and Shahi have both spoken about improving worker voice in factories and how they've leveraged technology and greater transparency to do this. Based on the work that the Children's Place has done with NEST, I know that within the informal and home worker supply chains, this probably looks really different due to the nature of production. So can you explain a little bit for the participants how transparency and technology play a role in your work and how it links to amplifying worker voice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think technology can certainly play a big role and an increasingly bigger role for integrating things like blockchain, software to document transactions in the supply chain, or eventually SMS mobile surveys to be able to monitor the efficiencies of compliance initiatives, or even to provide education to the worker level when our team or even a central business is not in the field. But in our work, we've actually seen that before we even get to the integration of the technology, we're often needing to start a couple steps back from that, where transparency is the actual critical piece, just to know what the supply chain looks like, and then to be able to identify all of the workers that fall within that supply chain. So as I mentioned in the last question, we often see hidden or unregistered workers. And these are really common when strong systems for monitoring are not in place. And almost always we find that through supply chain mapping, we reveal a lot of information that was previously unknown to both the supplier and the brand. So while supply chain mapping sometimes sounds like a relatively easy step, it can be challenging, especially when we think about larger or seasonally or disseminatedly based supply chains. So while this is a critical step, we really think that having worker well-being or improving worker well-being is really impossible without it. So once the supplier is able to establish this level of transparency, then it can move on to building stronger systems for inclusion and worker voice off of this. So in our work, usually when we start working with suppliers, a big focus with them is evaluating their own supply chains and then identifying which factors that I mentioned earlier, need to be taken into account to create a strong and an effective system to reach workers. So this really means getting into the field, getting connected, and getting to know the workers in the supply chain, demographically, culturally, location-wise, logistically, where are they, and how can those connect to the other parts of the supply chain. So we start by, working with the supplier to develop a more human-centered system for worker reporting that is accessible for workers, and then can address these concerns in a timely manner, considering that they are far away from a factory or from a central business. And then I think also really importantly that the workers are comfortable using that system. So unlike a factory where the workers are all together in one place, when you're working from home, you often don't have this face-to-face relationship with anyone in the business, or perhaps someone who's monitoring production, but is not necessarily, qualified to receive reports from workers and how to handle them. So we look at that, and then as well, look at what are the best ways for communicating. So again, I mentioned that there's, access to technology can be lacking, literacy levels are fluctuating. So that's something that we really need to take into account to figure out what the best way for workers to bring their voice or to bring a report to someone else in the supply chain. And then once all of this is kind of put into place and on paper, the bigger focus is on educating these workers. So they're not only just aware that the system exists, but that they see the system as a platform to support them, and that there's no fear of retaliation because they're not sure who the other person will be that they're talking to. They've never met them before. They don't really understand, why that system is there. So that's something we really want to kind of grow and strengthen over time. And so this is, a process that does take time, and sometimes it includes continued evolution in the system to ensure that it's working well in practice. But once it's created, this opens up other pathways for workers to have agency and greater voice within the home worker supply chain.
Thanks for sharing that. Anant, let's move back to you. So you shared with us earlier that mechanisms to capture worker voice are important to truly ensure good working conditions and well-being of factory workers. But what have been your learnings about the common worker voice mechanisms that exist today? What are they, and what are the gaps that you found?
Yeah, great question. I think, yes, of course, I guess we've been working on this for almost a decade now, 8 or 9 years when we first started thinking about the first kind of innovations in worker voice, or kind of trying to a grievance redressal kind of mechanism. And of course, when we started, there were existing systems. There's suggestion boxes, or kind of little pen and paper kinds of Dropbox kind of suggestions. There's HR representatives. There's worker elected committees, and so on. Let's just start with the bottom line. It's both exciting but informative that in this series of trials, which we'll talk more about, I think, a bit later, that introducing a digital tool with some new features worked. It measurably moved both workers' trust and faith in systems, their perceptions of the responsiveness of HR and management, and then as a result, their kinds of revealed attachment to the firm and preference and valuation of the job. They're more likely to stay with the firm, less likely to be absent, and in the latest trial, even more likely to be productive day in and day out. They're just more productive. Now, that's super exciting. We can talk more about that, but I think the one thing that we don't want to miss is that, look, the very fact that introducing a digital tool and maybe a few other features, which we'll go over, worked and had that kind of profound an impact tells you that the existing tools aren't working well enough, right? Just the very fact that we made a relatively small adjustment in introducing a new tool, had such a profound impact says, look, there was room to move. There was a lot left on the table in terms of what workers felt like they had access to in terms of the reporting. So now let's talk about what those features are. The reason why workers are trusting these mechanisms more, having more faith in them, and perceiving responsiveness, a greater responsiveness, is because with the traditional tools, there wasn't really, number one, there wasn't really anonymity in using them. You can always be seen writing something, dropping into the box, or be seen going to the office or talking to the HR representative. And so there's always risk, whether real or just expected, of reprisal, And you might even get them misconstrued. You might be going there to say that there's some issue with the bathroom, but a supervisor might think that you're reporting on them, and there might be reprisal. So those types of things. And then there's the access issue. You might want to be able to report something in the safety of your own home or outside the workplace or something like that, but you don't have access to those tools. If it's a box in the factory, when you go home and you're thinking about this issue and you're now ready to report something, you don't have access to it. So those are both things that are kind of improved upon when you have a digital tool that can be accessed from anywhere, via a text message or a smartphone or any of these mechanisms like the ones we've designed, and other tools kind of on the market have. But also there's a tracking element to it. So I can send a message. I know that it's getting logged in some system, in some dashboard where HR and management are keeping track that issue was logged. It doesn't get lost, right? And then there's a reporting back, even anonymously, but there's a reporting back that, hey, this issue has been received, we're working on it, and then you can report back regularly about what the progress is. That's really important for delivering on, I think, perceptions of responsiveness, and faith in the system that it's actually working. There are instances, even for example, where let's say a worker was comfortable enough or felt comfortable using a suggestion box, had access, was ready to report when they're in the factory, but then they don't hear back on whether the issue is being resolved. And it might take time to resolve that issue, but the worker may not realize that someone's working on it. Or the HR representative, not for lack of interest or effort, loses track of it. There's a million other things going on. Time is scarce, attention is scarce, So those are all the confluence of things that I think are resolved by a technical tool, by an innovation of this sort. And what that means is that I think via the series of trials, which I think we'll talk more about in a little bit, we're able to document the kind of theory of change as well, right? Yes, we're seeing these effects on retention and absenteeism and even productivity in the latest trial, but what's driving it? It's this increased trust and faith in the mechanism. It's this increased belief of responsiveness, perception of responsiveness, really belief in the value of actually reporting, faith that something can be done. And what's nice about that is that in that sense, I think the tool doesn't look like, Big Brother looking over the shoulder for even the HR representative. There's a buy-in because the tool actually makes the HR representative or the manager able to do their job better. It's a record that, hey, they're paying attention and they're working on a problem. And it's also a way of directing that scarce time and energy I was talking about to the problems they think are really happening. That's a classic problem with the kind of audits and things that we've been talking about, whether they're external audits from brands or they're even internal audits, like Chitra mentioned, from management of the firm itself that say, hey, we want to do some quarterly check-ins. That stuff it can be helpful, but it might come too few and far between, right? It's just a sample of workers every quarter or once a year. And by then, there might be a systemic problem that has really spread and caused a lot of issues. And you're only finding out once it's reached a fever pitch and it's a scandal of some sort, right? So what's nice about this digital tool is that you got access, it's real-time availability of reporting, you can track it, you can see trends that are happening and say, oh, is this an idiosyncratic problem? That doesn't make it any less important, but you can allocate resources accordingly. If this is a systemic problem that's growing and a lot of people are talking about it, we got to get to it fast. We don't have to wait for an audit to come around to learn about it. And then, like I said, if we're working on it, we can be seen working on it. We can show to anyone who cares that we're aware of the problem and we're putting efforts on it and so on. All of that kind of transparency, that reporting and tracking and so on can be really valuable in that sense.
That's really helpful. And I think the research is so important because it's actually validating what we believe these benefits are. So it's fascinating to hear those results. And so I think your research has led you to understand what these effective mechanisms are. You've talked about some of the features. Are there any other features? And can this be generalized to other industries as well, you think, past the garment and footwear industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think one major feature that we innovated on in the latest trial, right? So I said we had these kind of series of trials. We started with a much more like an internal audit type thing. Let's just push a survey. That actually, in and of itself, was had tremendous impacts. Then we went to analyzing kind of technical tools, digital tools that were existing on the market that improved on what we had before. It was a more available when you need it kind of thing. It showed that, hey, the workers value this. They're showing that they value this in the way that they stick with the firm, are less likely to be absent and so on, and report greater trust, even though they may not be using it. Maybe 3 or 4% over the course of a year of workers might actually have a grievance to report, but they know someone who did. They've heard that someone reported a grievance and got action. They saw it happening. They saw changes in policies and so on as a result. And that's enough. That option value is enough, right? So that's important. But in the latest version of this, in the tool that we designed, it was not just a tool. It was a tool that we improved on the accessibility across languages, across platforms, even for the less technically kind of comfortable and so on, SMS and voice in addition to smartphone and so on. So all of that was involved. But the other thing was to think about it as a program. and to involve incentives. And the big bit of that is not, like I said, I don't necessarily believe that HR representatives or managers didn't care about whether there were problems or didn't care about addressing problems, but that time is scarce, resources are scarce. Being able to direct your attention to the problems that are most pressing and most important and maybe persistent or systemic is a real help. Being able to be seen, to have a record that we're working on it, you know, not just to stakeholders and brands or the public, but to the worker themselves, you know, to communicate back and say, hey, I've heard you, I'm working on this problem. That was really helpful. And then the incentives really kind of were important for making progress in changing the status quo, right? At the end of the day, these are all just people. You're used to doing the job a certain way, you know? Let me prove to you that I got a tool that will make your life easier and make you more effective. Same effort, just go a further distance in solving the problem. But human behavior is to be stuck in habit, you know? And so the incentives helped, number one, signal that management, that the firm actually cares about these issues and wants you to kind of use this new tool and work harder at it and make progress. But also just that, give that nudge to say, look, let's really try to use the new tool. Let's use it for all it's worth and be faster at responding and be more complete in solving problems and then communicate back, you know, once we've solved the problem, or communicate back about why it's going to take some time or the complexity of it, you know, interact with the worker via that and via an anonymous means, which is really difficult to kind of do without a technology. So I think all of those features are tremendously important. What's really exciting is that incentive feature proved to be, you know, a game changer in terms of really getting, you know, reciprocity from the worker, getting buy-in and attachment from the worker. Like, it was only with those incentives that we saw daily productivity improving, which is a really tremendous thing. It's a major benefit to the firm in investing in this, a return on investing in this type of thing, which is exciting because that's a great lever we can pull to now drive adoption. That brings me to the second part of your question, I'm sorry, which is that, you know, I think once you think about it that way, there's nothing unique about garments. Any large workforce type industry can benefit from this. Any instance in which management feels like they're struggling to know what's going on the ground, they're hearing about problems too late once they become too big, you know, and too persistent and too systemic. Any of those types of situations can benefit from a tool like this because you're going to get more real-time reporting of issues that are coming up. You're going to be able to track trends and see problems as they're getting big and address them really quickly before they get too big, you know, direct resources. These types of incentive mechanisms are going to be valuable in organizations big and small, right? Any big organization struggles from this, that there's too much work to go around. There's all these layers. Signaling that we want you to focus on these types of worker issues can be hard when there's competing interests at play. This can be the right mechanism to direct attention, make these issues salient, and incentivize a focus on them. And so that's where I think, you know, GBL works in other regions than India, you know, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the US. And we work in lots of other industries now, automobile manufacturing, electronics manufacturing, fast food, service type stuff. And I see no reason why this isn't exactly as applicable or as valuable in those types of contexts. Any situation where you've got a really big organization, a lot of layers, and a big frontline workforce that needs your attention, but it's hard to give it to them, this is a tool that makes that easier.
Again, great insights into incentives and also the importance of confidentiality. So thank you. So let's move on to the third section here, where let's talk a little bit about ways for companies to build more inclusive models. And then we can go into the questions as well, because I see some great questions coming up here that we will want to take as well. So Sarah, let's start with you. So we now recognize the importance of informal workers and a unique nature of these supply chains from what you've been sharing today. What can brands and suppliers do to build more inclusive production models and promote worker well-being within their parts of the supply chain? What alternative supply chain models and company policies can be deployed to promote fair pay, equity, and inclusion in this part of the supply chain?
Yeah, thanks. That's such an important question. I know there's a lot of suppliers and brands just wanting to take action and to do something towards, increasing transparency. So I'll start from the supplier side. I think suppliers especially play such an important role in this process. And for us and from our experience, really having adoption of these values within the company is key to being able to, bring that same transparency down to the end worker level when we're talking about homeworking. And I think that's especially important when homeworking may have previously been seen as not a good thing to do, or when it was kind of overlooked as something outside of the supply chain. So really kind of changing that view and the mindset within a company is important. So once a supplier does decide to adopt these practices into the company's values, we really encourage the leaders of that business to educate and instill this adoption throughout their team. So emphasizing really the roles and responsibilities that each person has, at different levels, especially those who are working in the field and are maybe even closer to the home workers, so that they understand that there's a shared goal for inclusion here, the same as what might be the case in the factory level as well. And so if you're a bigger supplier like Shahi, who already has an established internal compliance team, then we recommend ensuring that the implementation of due diligence is included at the home worker level, or if it's not, how do you add that into the standard practices that you have and add it as part of your sustained compliance program. And if you're a smaller supplier who doesn't necessarily have a designated compliance team, that's a good point to evaluate the bandwidth that you need to ramp up the necessary practices within your own supply chain. And so once that's kind of addressed internally, the next step is to get out into the supply chain and get familiar with, both any subcontractors as well as the actual workers. And I think a big part of this, when we talk about just straight compliance and then eventually to worker voice is education. And I think that a lot of subcontractors, this may be new to them, or they haven't necessarily had the expectation to, implement these compliance systems within the work that they do. So rather than just coming in and saying, you're required to do this, now do it, being there to provide both education and support to them is really important, so that they can in turn adopt those practices and extend them further to the home worker level. And then, once more value and importance is placed on inclusion and equity for home workers, we think that the worker voice systems and structures are then just a natural stepping stone from there on, and building those up. From the other side, for brands, for us in our experience, we really see the embrace of homeworking as a first step. So, if you're embracing homeworking and you're including it as a normal part of your sourcing practices, then, there's definitely a way to have transparency and know that there's tools and resources and programs out there that can help you to increase that visibility. So we really recommend brands starting first with the review of their own policies. And this is not only their written policies, but also their verbal policies and how they're communicating with the brand or with the suppliers that they work with on how homeworking is, seen or valued, or what the expectations are. And as I mentioned before, if homeworking was looked down upon or even, banned previously within the sourcing, we just want to make sure that now it's more open and accepted, so that workers who are, working from home, they're not kind of in a position where they haven't been disclosed for fear that there'll be negative repercussions, but rather, kind of opening up and having more transparency and visibility. And so we've seen in our own experience that when brands have done this, that they've really had much more disclosure from their suppliers and more cooperation to be open and look for solutions to create transparency. And so for brands, I think the most important role here is really to play as a partner in a supportive, collaborative kind of, I don't know, like sharing thoughts on ways to address parts of the supply chain that may be trickier to work in, and how the supplier can, have the support from the brand to increase the implementation of compliance practices. And so when it comes to informal workers within the supply chain, we really want to encourage brands to find out more about the supply chain and how those home workers are engaging within it. I mentioned before that some workers are more seasonal, and when that happens, it does become harder for suppliers to be able to kind of monitor, but as well educate and continue compliance practices if there's only seasonal production. So if possible, can brands have stronger relationships with those suppliers and the communities they work with, so that there's more success for programs like Worker Voice to really have impact over time. And so to support brands with this and then provide guidance on immediate actions, we've also recently released a set of free open access tools and resources that can be leveraged by brand teams along with their suppliers as a way to really start building strong foundations for further and more focused gender equity, inclusion, and then ultimately more worker voice activities in the supply chain.
Thanks. And there's a process here I think you've mentioned in the past. Brands have not really focused on this or have had policies to ban home working. And this is really a recognition, I think, by brands to be able to look beyond the traditional manufacturing in the four walls of a factory and understand their supply chain, to know if there is homework in that supply chain and to make a positive impact. So thanks for sharing that. Chitra, I know I saw a note that you've been having some internet issues. So can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll
try.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Okay, great. So we'll ask a question for you. So while it's great that Shahi Exports is actively investing in worker voice and other well-being initiatives, I know that it might not be possible for smaller companies to do the same thing, given resource constraints. So what would you say is the need of the hour today to encourage companies to set up these mechanisms for capturing worker voice and also ensure they're being taken seriously? Do you think that brands and local government have a role to play in this process?
Yeah, so like whether it is big firm or like Shahi, or whether it is a small job work unit, or even it is the people whom we care about. So we also have seen Shahi has done a lot of worker well-being initiatives, and through anecdotal evidence we have seen that investing on a worker voice and also well-being initiatives, that the business also grows. It's along with work, business also grows. And gone are the days when business has just to do with mere production. Now business is all about blend of production. There's quality, marketing, compliance, there's social sustainability, environment sustainability, and the core of everything being worker well-being. And it's not one responsibility. I think it's everyone's responsibility. And especially talking about brands also have a major role to play because of the kind of 4 year work suppliers. And you can always make this as part of the vendor score rating, and you can also add worker voice as the tool, as part of the compliance. You can closely partner with some of the NGOs or organizations. Projects is not the not just limited to factories, but it actually can go beyond. Apart from this, government also has a huge role. I feel people were talking about legislation. So to go in a path of gender parity, government also has a maybe worker voice, maybe some policies or some system should also go in legislation part of government, and government also can start working on providing some subsidies for organizations, just like skill development subsidies, maybe some together as we're working on gender subsidies should go and the finance should come as a part of government programs as well. Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Hope you were able to hear me.
Yes, we got most of that. Thank you. And I think the crux of that is, it's something that everybody needs to focus on. There are lots of different stakeholders, lots of different avenues for this. So, investing the time and the resources to understand what can be done is important for smaller companies. So Anant, I'm going to finish off with you before we get into questions here. And I love hearing about your research. So I want you to tell us a bit about the trials that you mentioned earlier. Are there any initial findings that you've had? Have there been any interesting or surprising results you can share with the group?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question. I always love talking about the research, so long as people love hearing about it. But I think this is a really exciting kind of agenda. Like I said, we've had now 3 completed trials kind of sequentially, adding features, thinking about other outcomes that we're interested in measuring and trying to get the full idea of the effects. I guess the first thing I want to emphasize, which is not surprising, but it's definitely very exciting, is that it works. Like I said, on the one hand, you can use that as emphasis that the existing tools left a lot to be desired. There was need for some innovation and for some improvement. But I think it's really exciting to know that we made some progress. There's a lot of problems that are persistent and that are hard to make progress on. It's really exciting to know that the digital tools that are on the market, in addition to ours, make some progress there, and that we're able to build on that with features, but with also, like I said, the incentives and so on, and make a lot of progress there. And we're seeing that progress, like I said before, not just in, first and foremost on the kind of mechanisms of change, theory of change kind of stuff. Trust is going up, faith in the systems is going up amongst workers, perceptions of responsiveness, satisfaction around those mechanisms are going up. That's really core, first order important. And then secondly, that translates into really exciting stuff, like workers are less likely to quit. They're feeling a valuation of this job, a stronger valuation of this job. Absenteeism is going down, and then, like I said, in the most recent completed trial that we're just kind of polishing up the paper on, but the trial is done, that involve the incentives, that productivity goes up day in and day out at the full factory level. Those are outcomes that are hard to move. It's not a small thing if you can change the productivity of a whole factory by a measurable amount and kind of persistently over a long period of time, a year plus. That's really exciting. So that's the first thing. Like I said, not surprising. We kind of hoped we were going to find that. But I'll be honest, I am a bit surprised and certainly excited by the magnitude of what we're finding, and that it worked, that we got it right, it seems like, step by step. The other thing I think that actually is surprising and is really nice, but only was revealed by this trial, is that it seems like one important mechanism by which this works is kind of option value, or like the insurance of knowing that such a mechanism exists, such a tool exists. That's to say that a worker doesn't have to use it. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but let me expand a little bit. A worker doesn't have to actually use the tool to seem to value it, okay? In a lot of these trials, the last 2 trials we did, where we're using this digital tool that's kind of like always available. You can access it at any time if you need it. Only 3 or 4% of the treatment group that has access to this actually uses it at the worker level, let's say over a year or a year and a half. That doesn't mean that, you've got thousands of workers, but a couple of hundred problems. It doesn't mean those problems aren't super important and worth addressing and absolutely necessary to address. But what that means is that if we're seeing on average that in 1,000 workers or more, that they're trusting the solution more, having stronger faith in the mechanism, more likely to stay with the firm, less likely to be absent, more productive, then what that's saying is that there's a whole bunch of workers who aren't actually having a grievance at the moment to report, but they're valuing the ability, the knowledge that, hey, it's there if I need it. And when my friend did report, they saw a response and it was valuable and so on. It worked. that's really cool, I think, and that's really, I think, another point that emphasizes the digital tool over the existing mechanism in some sense, that it's a cheap and easy way to have the solution always available to whoever who needs it, anyone who needs it. Management doesn't know who to ask, right? If you think about the analog kind of version of this, where it's like, okay, well, I'll take a dipstick kind of measure every quarter and I'll do a random survey and so on, but you may not get the small set of people who have something to say that's important. You might miss it, if you do it that way. If you've got this mechanism that's always on, it's there if you need it, you get to hear about stuff early, right? When, before it becomes a major problem and in a time to address it. And the workers value that. So that, I think, is really, really cool and was a bit surprising. I didn't expect to have such a big impact on all of these cost centers for the firm and all of these critical measures of worker well-being from the worker side, with such, kind of modest, utilization in any in a real-time sense, in a continuous time sense. The other thing I hit on, which I think is really exciting and I want to emphasize, is the value of these incentives that we saw when you go from, of course, analog to digital, you saw an improvement. But when you go from digital to digital tool, but also this incentive program around it to really get buy-in from HR to respond and management to kind of signal value for this mechanism and so on, you saw an even bigger increase, right? You saw that's where we got this kind of productivity gain, for example. And in my mind, as an economist, I see that productivity gain as a bit of like a more subtle inframarginal thing, right? The way we think about these tools is often going back to kind of Albert Hirschman's early work in the 70s on this. It's like exit and voice, If you give a worker a voice in this setting, okay, they won't have to take dire reaction by quitting the firm. But that's, I think, a relatively small win, right? Like if all we're getting is that, the worker doesn't leave, we may not necessarily be making the worker comfortable and happy, right? What's exciting about the incentives here is that day in and day out, they're just more productive. They're feeling less stressed. There's a lot of mechanisms by which they're feeling a stronger attachment to the firm. They feel like the firm cares about them. There's many mechanisms for that. Those can be hard to illuminate, and I don't know that I have the full answer on exactly why, although the paper will try to work a bit more on that as we develop it. But it's definitely true that that's a more subtle and I think powerful and exciting way that the worker is showing that they're feeling valued and that they're valuing this tool. And I think that that's only delivered by the incentives. And that actually makes sense to me in the sense that we want to make sure as a firm, that's trying to adopt the solution, that you're sending the right signal to every layer of the managerial hierarchy that this is important, that we're investing in this tool, get on board, use it, solve the workers' problems when they come quickly, completely, so on and so forth. And when you do that, the worker sees it, seems to see it and value it. And then that means every day feel a little bit more able and empowered to work hard. What's cool about that also is that like I said, if I go back to the beginning, that's more for everyone kind of thing, right? We took care of the worker. The workers are more productive. They're more able to earn bonuses. The firm, is able to be more productive and complete more orders. There's more to go around. And that's that kind of rare, but a really exciting lever the GBL likes to see that, okay, we might be able to pull this and then everyone in the ecosystem kind of benefits in some sense. This feels like that. There's more work to do, don't get me wrong, to get it ready to scale up even within the garment industry, to get it ready to be adopted in other industries and so on. But this is a really exciting step forward. So I think that's also surprising, just how well the incentives work. If I can congratulate us just a little bit, because I want to be careful, I think that means we designed the incentives right. That's a hard thing to do, and I'm really proud of my team, of the GBL design team and so on, that really carefully walked through talking to every agent in the along the line to understand, okay, what are the types of incentives that should work? How should they be designed? How should we measure performance? So on and so forth. What should the prize be? And so on and so forth. So that's cool. It means that we designed them well. But I think the more exciting thing is that it corroborates the notion I had earlier on that all the intentions are on average in the right place. See, the incentives could have gone bad, right? It could have been, suppose the HR agents and the managers actually didn't care about this work. They saw this as a nuisance. You know, they saw the tool as like, they almost resented the tool because it measured, you know, how much effort they were putting forward on these problems, or, you know, as a measure of how poorly they were resolving issues or something like that. The incentives could have gone really bad. It could have killed the whole thing, right? They could have driven resentment in the solution, no buy-in, and so on and so forth. But what we were doing when we designed the solution and tried to test it with these incentives is that we were hypothesizing that that wasn't the case. We were hypothesizing that these HR, you know, representatives want to solve workers' problems. It's why they took this job to begin with. And so if we can show them that, hey, here's a tool that works for you, it's actually going to make your efforts go further, you know, and that it's going to be a record of how hard you're actually working. Even when sometimes the workers feel like you're not solving their problems, let's make sure that they know you're working on it and making progress. Let's give you a means to talk back and forth with them and see why the solution you tried isn't the right one, so on and so forth. So that, I think, is a really, like, I don't know, that gives me a warm glow that the incentive corroborated that in some sense, that it showed that it didn't push us the other way. It didn't make anyone, like, you know, resent the tool or on average make them not buy in. It actually did achieve what we thought, which is that, hey, we can all really rally around these problems and work together on it. And so the tech tool and the program and all of this is just going to get us on the same page. It's going to help us kind of work together on this. So that was exciting.
That is exciting. And yes, you can pat yourselves on the back. Fantastic work. And thank you for sharing that as well. I think, you know, the connection to productivity and how it helps for business is just so key. And it's great to hear that you found that. The other thing from a brand perspective that I just want to highlight that you said that I find really interesting is, you found that approximately 4% of the workforce is using the tool, yet you've seen the effects cascade throughout the entire workforce in terms of trust, in terms of perception. And I think that's really important for brands. As a brand who has worked with suppliers to try to put this in with some partners, you know, we would be here saying, okay, well, there's not a lot of participation. So is that a good thing? Does that mean there's no issues? Or if you were to see a lot of participation, is that a good thing? Or is that, too many issues? And I think the bottom line here is that the system implemented in a workplace really drives that perception, even if you're not seeing people use it. And I think it's a really interesting insight. So thanks for sharing. All right, so we have only a few minutes. It looks like we have 8 minutes for questions. Before we get in, I just really want to thank the panelists for their participation and their insights. I think it's been a really great discussion, and I hope everybody's taken some great information away. But we definitely want to ask a few questions here. Let me go. I know our team is gathering some questions. I've also seen a number of participants ask about, the study and some more of the research when it's available. So it would be great if we can, supply some information or links in the chat for the participants, since we only have a few minutes left here. But let's pull a couple questions here, and then we'll get through as many as we can. So first question is for Sarah. So is it primarily brands or suppliers who are looking for home workers? What risks and benefits does homework offer that factories do not?
Yeah, that's a great question. At least from my standpoint, I see that the decision to use home workers has really been driven by a supplier and, what they need for production and how they could, leverage the use of home-based workers to support that. I think brands, as I said, in the past may have been against home working, but now are starting to turn more towards the acceptance and then inclusion of home working. In terms of the risks and benefits, I certainly can understand that it is more risky just in terms of transparency, but as I've kind of been sharing during the session, I think there's a lot more opportunity to build transparency within the supply chain, and of course technology plays a huge role in that. But what we've really seen is a benefit. I think, speaking from an NGO perspective, I've seen a lot of suppliers be able to take advantage of the flexibility that homework offers and that piece rate work in general offers for, this expansion of production or the growth of production, as well as being able to meet the needs of different buyers. As well, very recently, during the pandemic, a lot of home workers were able to continue their work because they were based at home and they didn't have the same challenges as someone in a factory who couldn't physically go into the factory and do work. So we really saw that, home workers were very resilient during this period, and were able to continue working, to continue supplying the supply chains, and as well be earning income for their families. So I'll keep it short in the interest of time, but I do think that there's definitely a lot of pros from the home working side as well.
Thank you. Next question is for Chitra. What kind of issues or compliance issues, excuse me, let me go back up here, would workers be auditing? Does Shahi have worker committees to channel worker voice?
Yeah, we have committees. We have 5 very working committees of as per the law requirement. And they are also functioning very well. Apart from this, talking about, what was the next question, Adrian? Yeah, and
Does Shahi have worker committees to channel worker voice?
Yeah, we do have workers committee to channel the worker voice. Apart from that, another question asked was what do we expect from Shahi from the workers to audit? So we are in a, our major focus would be developing workers as compliance auditors. Mostly first, maybe year one would be to start with the routine stuff, maybe the basic COCs. What the local requirement, the law requires, and also maybe the next year we'll also add addition of in ID Act and a few other things. So basically, to start with maybe the routine stuffs of compliance requirement, but as years pass by, we'd also like to get them into more critical issues of the compliance, and also reach to a level where they're also part of talking to brands when they come for compliance audits, and also be part of the system talking about most difficult critical aspects, and also we believe that issues of factories, if it is bought from the worker level, most of the issues, if you resolve it internally at the first level, the most of the compliance requirements also will be met, and also the issues what was happening around keeping worker centric would be resolved.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Anant. This looks like a 5-part question, so I'll get through a few questions, and you can choose which ones you want to answer here, Anant. So have you seen any successful tools or mechanisms that can mitigate the issues of low access or understanding of technology? Are there plans to increase the number of companies using this tool? What's the best way to scale it? And additionally, is this tool open source for others?
Great. I think these are great questions, important questions. I tried to answer a few of those in the chat in between, but I'll try to summarize here. So on the first point, I think the access thing is really big. In fact, part of what we realized through our first couple of trials and what we tried to build into our own kind of tool, the reason why we even bothered to build our own tool was that the context will determine the country context, the industry, the technological advancement, and so on, of your particular population you have in mind will determine how well an existing tool will work. In this setting, language is a problem. Access to a smartphone is a problem. Comfort level, even if you have access to a smart mode, comfort level with using smart features is a problem. And so we built in voice voice transcription kind of mechanisms and so on. So you could access it as well as SMS. So you could access it in many different ways. So we tried to solve that there, but I think you have to be explicit about that. And now that might not be, they may be less necessary in, electronics manufacturing in a Chinese context, but in garment manufacturing in India, it was really important. And so that's part of the complexity of this type of thing. You have to start kind of back from square one. The tools existed. Voice wasn't a new concept. Like I said, I quoted a researcher from 1970. This is not new, but doing it well and doing it for a particular context involves literally, having no ego about that and going back down to the ground and saying, wait a minute, for this particular type of worker in this particular work environment, what can they do? How do they need to be able to access it? So on and so forth. So that was one. Secondly was, I think, on the scale up, I believe. Is that right, Adrian?
Yep.
I think that, so just to say that we are absolutely excited to scale this up across country contexts and across industries. unlike some tools we have designed, tested, and are now trying to scale up, I think this one is one that, more immediately is applicable to a wide array of industries. There are others that, for example, their trainings and maybe specific to a specific industry. That doesn't mean they can't be scaled up, but they might need to be re-engineered a bit more. I think the industry here is kind of not going to be a challenge at all, or at least it's going to be a much smaller challenge to translate this. Like I said, any industry with a large frontline workforce where management feels like they're struggling to understand what's going on the front lines and in a timely way, this can be adopted and should be adopted. The country context, like I just talked about, that's going to be a bigger challenge in some sense. So I see us being able to scale up in India or South Asia across garments really easily, but even outside of garments, we're absolutely ready for the challenge to do this in a totally different regional context with a different technological level of advancement, different digital divide, different features and so on. But that's gonna be hard. That brings me a bit, I think, to the last question, which is that the one that I mentioned it in the channel, but the one thing that we've realized at GBL over the years is that I think when we first schemed of this, we thought, okay, we'll identify problems, we'll design solutions, we'll test them rigorously. For anything we realize works, and by works, I mean both solves the worker's problem, delivers value back to the worker, but also seems to deliver on firm outcomes that affect the bottom line, things that make money for the firm. This is a great, ideal dual benefit type solution. Hey, isn't our work going to be done then? We just draw up a blueprint, we share it with the world, and it should spread like wildfire. And maybe I was too idealistic, but that's what I thought when we first started. And the problem is that we've never seen that happen. None of these kind of blueprint open source solutions really take shape. They never take off as well as we think. And I think that's probably now in retrospect, maybe not that surprising, in the sense that, a garment manufacturer or a brand for that matter, or an electronics manufacturer, whatever. I mean, they're already struggling to do their day-to-day job. They're operating in a competitive market with thin margins, and they're experts in making garments. They're not experts in designing, a technological solution for anonymous communication in their workforce and then adopting it and then doing the change management bit and designing the solution. The fact that it took us years to do it, and maybe one would call us experts in that type of stuff, even though we don't feel like it every day, tells you that you can't just do that. You can't just leave it for other people to take up, even if it's in their best interest. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources. So all of that is to say that I think there are going to be challenges to scale up in some industries. There are going to be challenges to scale up in some context for this tool more than the industries. And that's why I think for some of these types of solutions that we know work, like this one, we're realizing we need to actually go out and go one step further and be a service provider. Create a product that we can offer to employers and to maybe brands want to sponsor it. Who the payer is can vary depending on the situation. But we have to actually be the service provider. Otherwise it doesn't take on. And there's a huge amount of benefit we know is there, but you can't realize it if you don't, actually help, deliver that adoption, train employers on how to use it and adopt it and so on.
Thank you, Anant, for the perspective. Appreciate that. So I think we're 3 minutes over our time limit, and I'm sure we could continue if we had more time. There's lots of questions, and this is such an interesting dialogue. But I wanted to thank a few folks before we break. Thanks to the NEST and the Good Business Lab for organizing this today. Want to thank each of our panelists for their great insights and their time today. Really appreciate some of the information that you shared, and hopefully the audience has found it interesting. And then for everyone who's joined us, thanks for your time today. Hope you have found the panel interesting, and we appreciate the support and the time. We wish everybody a good rest of their day. Take care, everybody.
Adrian. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Great.